The old man, Elias Thorne, watched the dog from the porch steps, a mug of coffee growing cold in his weathered hands. For 3 days, it had been the same. Buster, his 12-year-old blue heeler, a dog whose entire existence had been a study in pragmatic, working silence, was behaving like a creature possessed. He wasn't chasing rabbits or barking at distant coyotes. He was digging. He was digging in a single, obsessive spot near the gnarled roots of the ancient oak that stood as a silent sentinel on the property line. The digging was a frantic, desperate act, punctuated by high, keening whines that scraped at the edges of the morning calm. Dust and dark soil flew in rhythmic plumes, coating the dog's blue-gray fur until he looked like a frantic ghost clawing his way out of the earth rather than into it. Elias had tried everything. He'd called, his voice a stern command that had never once been ignored in over a decade. Buster hadn't even flinched. He'd offered a thick cut of steak, fresh from the grill, holding it so the scent wafted directly over the frenzied activity. The dog, whose life revolved around the anticipation of such treats, paid it no mind. His paws, once tough as old leather, were now raw and bleeding, staining the upturned soil with small, dark blossoms of crimson. Yet he did not stop. The sun beat down on the parched Texas land, and the air hummed with the drone of cicadas, a sound usually synonymous with lazy peace. But now, overlaid with the incessant scratching and panting from the dog, it felt like the sound of a fever. Elias felt a deep, primal unease settling in his bones. This was more than animal instinct. It was a compulsion, a ritual. It was a message he couldn't decipher, delivered with a terrifying urgency that defied all logic and loyalty. The dog was a living oracle, speaking a language of dirt and desperation, and the message, whatever it was coming from that one unhallowed patch of ground. Elias set the mug down on the wooden railing, the ceramic making a dull thud that seemed to be swallowed by the vast, open space of the ranch. The time for passive observation was over. The dog's distress had become a physical weight in the air, a wrongness that needed to be addressed. He descended the porch steps, his boots kicking up small puffs of ochre dust. As he approached, the intensity of Buster's labor grew more palpable. The dog's breathing was ragged, a series of harsh, wet rasps that spoke of utter exhaustion. Yet his legs pumped like pistons, driven by a force beyond mere muscle. Elias knelt, placing a hand on the dog's trembling back. "Easy, boy." Easy now. The words were useless, absorbed by the frantic energy emanating from the animal. Buster didn't even acknowledge the touch. He was lost, his mind locked onto whatever secret the earth held. The hole was now nearly 2 feet deep, a ragged wound in the otherwise unbroken expanse of dry grass. Elias peered into the darkness, smelling the damp, mineral scent of deep soil. He saw nothing but roots and rocks. He tried to pull the dog away, his hands gripping Buster's collar. For the first time in their shared history, the dog resisted him, growling low in his chest, a guttural sound of protest that was both shocking and heartbreaking. He wasn't growling at Elias, the old man realized. He was growling at the interruption. At the delay. Whatever he was trying to unearth, he believed it was a task more important than his master, more important than his own well-being. A cold dread, sharper than the morning chill, traced a path down Elias's spine. The land, his land, which he knew as well as the lines on his own hands, suddenly felt alien. That single patch of ground beneath the oak felt like a festering secret, and his loyal companion was trying to tear it open for the world to see. He let go of the collar, stood up, and turned his gaze toward the barn. There was only one way to end this. He had to help him dig. With a heavy sigh that stirred the dust around his boots, Elias walked the long 100 yards to the barn. The air inside was thick with the scent of hay, oil, and old leather, a familiar perfume that did little to calm his frayed nerves. He retrieved a spade and a pickaxe, the tools feeling unnaturally heavy in his hands. As he walked back toward the oak tree, the rhythmic sound of Buster's frantic digging was a metronome counting down to a revelation he was not sure he wanted. When he reached the spot, the dog was beginning to falter, his movements growing weaker. He was still digging, but his body was failing him. Elias spoke softly, "All right, boy. I'll take it from here." He nudged the exhausted animal aside with the flat of the spade. Buster collapsed onto the grass, his chest heaving, but his eyes never left the hole. They were fixed, wide, and waiting. Elias plunged the spade into the loose soil Buster had excavated. The first few scoops were easy. Then the blade struck something with a dull, unyielding thud. Not a rock. The sound was softer, more organic. He switched to the pickaxe, carefully chipping away at the compacted earth around the object. He worked methodically, the sun climbing higher in the sky, beating down on his neck. Sweat dripped from his brow, stinging his eyes. Finally, he had cleared enough dirt to see it. It was dark, wrinkled, and unmistakably leather. A bag. An old doctor's satchel, maybe, its material hardened and decayed by decades underground. He worked the spade beneath it, gently prying it from its earthen tomb. It was heavier than it looked. With a final grunt of effort, he lifted it out and placed it on the grass. Buster crept forward, sniffing at the strange object before letting out a soft whine and lying down, placing his head on his raw paws. His work was done. Elias's hands trembled slightly as he fumbled with the rusted metal clasps. They broke away under the pressure. He peeled back the stiff, rotting leather flap. Inside, wrapped in a surprisingly well-preserved sheet of oilcloth, was a bundle. He unwrapped it carefully. The secret the earth had held, the reason for his dog's madness, was a collection of small, fragile, horrifyingly human bones. They were the bones of a newborn child. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Elias's own ragged breath. If you've ever felt that chill of a mystery breaking wide open, you need to subscribe to our channel, because this story is just getting started. That evening, as twilight painted the vast Texas sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, a pair of headlights cut a path through the dust of the long driveway. It was Silas Croft, his neighbor from the adjacent ranch. Elias watched from the porch as Croft's truck rattled to a stop. He emerged with a familiar, easygoing smile and a bottle of amber liquid in his hand. "So your light's on, Elias," Croft called out, his voice carrying a folksy warmth that suddenly felt manufactured and hollow. "Figured you might be in the mood for a sip of something proper." Elias didn't move from his chair. He just watched the man approach, his mind racing. The unearthed satchel was hidden deep in his cellar, but the disturbed earth by the oak tree was a fresh scar on the land, visible to anyone who cared to look. Croft mounted the steps, his gaze sweeping over the yard before settling on Elias. "Heard your dog causing a ruckus the last few days. Everything all right with old Buster?" The question was casual, but the man's eyes were sharp, probing. They weren't the eyes of a concerned neighbor, they were the eyes of an assessor. "He's fine," Elias said, his own voice flat and hard. "Just got a hold of a scent he couldn't shake." Croft chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. He settled into the other rocking chair, placing the whiskey bottle on the small table between them. "Dogs are like that. Stubborn creatures." He paused, his eyes drifting pointedly toward the dark silhouette of the distant oak tree. "Find anything interesting over there?" Must have been something special to get him that worked up. The question hung in the air, heavy and laden with unspoken meaning. The easygoing neighbor persona was a thin veneer, and Elias could now see the cracks. Beneath it was something cold, something calculating. The threat was no longer a vague feeling of wrongness from the soil, it was sitting 3 feet away from him, smelling of cheap whiskey and veiled interrogation. Elias felt the cold grip of isolation. He was an old man on a vast, lonely stretch of land, and he had just uncovered a secret that someone, a man who knew exactly where to look, clearly wanted to remain buried. The two men sat in a deepening silence, the chirping of crickets filling the void. Croft's presence was an oppressive weight, a physical manifestation of the danger Elias now faced. The neighborly facade had evaporated, leaving behind a chilling tension that vibrated in the humid night air. Elias knew he was at a crossroads, a moment where the path of his life would diverge, irrevocably. He held a terrible secret in his cellar, a century-old crime cradled in rotting leather. He could see the path of self-preservation laid out before him, clear and tempting. He could wake before dawn, take the spade, and return the small bones to the earth. He could fill the hole, scatter some seeds, and let the grass grow over the scar. He could tell Croft the dog had just been chasing a stubborn badger. He could feign ignorance, smile, and accept the offered whiskey. He could choose to live out his remaining years in the quiet peace he had always known, pretending the wrongness under the oak tree did not exist. His life would continue, uninterrupted. The alternative was a dark, uncertain path. To pursue this meant walking toward the danger that was now sitting on his porch. It meant confronting a darkness that had festered on this land for generations. It meant inviting violence and chaos into his solitary world. It was a path that led away from safety and toward a confrontation with a man whose eyes held a predatory stillness. He would be alone, armed with nothing but a terrible truth against a legacy of hidden corruption. The choice was stark. What would you do? Would you rebury the secret, choosing the quiet life you have always known, or would you risk everything you have to unearth a justice for a soul who has no one left to speak for them? Elias made his choice in the silence of his own heart. He would not be the man who reburied a child's bones to save his own skin. He met Croft's gaze, his expression unreadable as stone. "Just an old coyote den," he said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "Buster's getting old." Seeing ghosts, Croft nodded slowly, a thin smile playing on his lips. He didn't believe it, but he accepted the temporary truce. He eventually left, the taillights of his truck a receding evil in the darkness. Once he was gone, Elias felt no relief, only the grim certainty of his chosen path. He didn't trust the local authorities. The Crofts were an old family, their roots tangled deep in the county's power structure. He was on his own. He went not to the cellar, but to his late father's study, a room preserved in dust and time. For hours, he searched, pulling out heavy, leather-bound ledgers and brittle boxes of correspondence. He was looking for a whisper, a hint, any echo of the crime he now held in his hands. In the back of a large roll-top desk, he found a small, locked metal strongbox. He pried it open with a crowbar. Inside, nestled amongst yellow deeds and tax records, was a bundle of letters tied with faded twine. They were from his great-grandfather, Horatio Thorne, written to a lawyer in Austin. The letters, penned in elegant, looping script, detailed a bitter dispute with the Croft family of that era over water rights from the creek that bordered their properties. But the dispute was secondary to the true horror hinted at in the pages. Horatio wrote of a family of migrant workers, a man named Matteo and his wife Elena, who had worked for him. He described them as good, honest people with a newborn baby girl. They had saved enough to make a down payment on the small parcel of land where the oak tree now stood. Then, one day, they vanished. The Crofts claimed they'd packed up and left in the night, but Horatio was suspicious. He wrote of the Crofts immediately damming the creek and fencing off the disputed parcel. He suspected the darkest of deeds, but he had no proof, only a profound sense of injustice. Tucked into the last letter was a small, faded ambrotype photograph, a young, serious-looking woman holding a swaddled infant. Elena. The child in his cellar. The truth was now whole. The Crofts hadn't just stolen water and land. They had stolen lives, burying a family to build their legacy. The depth of this revelation sent a tremor through Elias. If you want to see how this century-old crime is finally brought to justice, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Armed with the weight of history, Elias felt a grim resolve settle over him. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a powerful sense of duty. He was no longer just Elias Thorne, rancher. He was the executor of a century-old will, the last voice for a family silenced by greed. He took the letters and the small, fragile photograph from the strongbox. He didn't take a weapon. The truth, he felt, was the only weapon he needed. He left his house as the sun began to cast long, golden fingers across the land, Buster trotting silently at his heels. He walked with purpose, not toward the road, but directly across his property, toward the fence line marked by the ancient oak. He saw him from a distance. Silas Croft was there, standing on his side of the fence, staring at the disturbed patch of earth near the tree's roots. It was as if the place called to him, a monument to his family's original sin. Elias stopped a few feet from the barbed wire, the fence a symbolic and physical barrier between them. Croft turned slowly, his face devoid of the folksy charm he'd worn the night before. His expression was flat, his eyes cold and watchful. "Morning, Elias," he said, his voice stripped of all pretense. "Came to check on that coyote den." Elias didn't answer the jibe. He held up the photograph. "I know who she was," he said, his voice steady and clear, carrying across the small distance between them. "Her name was Elena. Her husband was Matteo. And the child you were so interested in, she had a name, too, I'm sure." He then pulled out the letters, holding them up for Croft to see. "My great-grandfather wrote it all down. About the water rights. About the land. About how a family disappeared right after the Croft family suddenly got a little richer." He wasn't yelling. He wasn't accusing. He was simply stating facts, laying the cornerstones of a truth that had been buried for generations. Silas Croft's face, which had been a mask of callous indifference, began to crumble. A flicker of something primal and violent sparked in his eyes. The charade was over. Silas's body went rigid. The thin veneer of civility shattered, revealing the feral cunning that had been passed down through his bloodline. "That land is ours," he hissed, his voice a low, venomous rasp. "Paid for with silence. My great-grandfather secured our future. Your family were weak then, and you're weak now." In a blur of sudden, vicious motion, Silas vaulted the barbed wire fence. He moved with a surprising agility, landing squarely on Thorn property. A long, thin-skinning knife materialized in his hand, its blade glinting with malicious intent in the morning sun. "You should have left it buried, old man," he snarled, advancing on Elias. Elias stood his ground, the old letters still clutched in one hand. He was old, yes, but his life of hard ranch work had forged a sinewy strength in him. He braced himself for the attack, his world narrowing to the space between him and the advancing blade. But he was not alone. From the side, a flash of blue-gray fur shot forward. Buster, who had been standing as still and silent as a statue, launched himself at Silas. There was no warning bark, only the pure, focused violence of a loyal protector. He sank his teeth deep into the fleshy part of Silas's knife arm. Silas roared in pain and surprise, his arm flailing as he tried to shake the dog loose. The knife clattered to the ground. The momentary distraction was all Elias needed. He lunged forward, not with the finesse of a fighter, but with the raw, desperate power of a man defending his home and his history. He slammed his shoulder into Silas's chest, driving him backward. The two men crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs, dust, and fury. The fight was brutal and graceless, a desperate struggle in the shadow of the great oak, the silent witness to the original crime. As they grappled in the dirt, the sky above, which had been a clear and indifferent blue, began to darken. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and ozone. A storm was coming. Elias fought with the strength of righteous fury. He was older, but Silas, weakened by the dog's relentless grip on his arm, was off balance. Elias drove his fist into the man's jaw, a solid, cracking sound that echoed the snapping of a dry branch. Silas slumped, his eyes rolling back slightly. Elias scrambled on top of him, pinning him to the ground. Buster, as if sensing the fight was won, finally released his hold, a low growl still rumbling in his chest as he stood guard, his fur bristling. Elias used Silas's own belt to bind his hands behind his back, pulling the leather tight. He was breathing heavily, his body aching, the adrenaline starting to fade into a deep, throbbing exhaustion. He looked at the man lying defeated on the ground, the final, pathetic heir to a legacy of murder and theft. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, spattering in the dust around them. Elias walked back to his house, every step a monumental effort. He didn't call the local sheriff. He called the state rangers, his voice hoarse but clear as he explained that he had detained a man for assault and that there was something at the property line they needed to investigate. The rangers arrived within the hour, their professional calm a stark contrast to the violent chaos that had just unfolded. They listened to Elias's story, their faces grim as he showed them the letters, the photograph, and the small, cloth-wrapped bundle of bones. They took a gagged and cursing Silas Croft into custody. As the rain began to fall in earnest, washing the blood and dust from the hallowed ground, a forensics team began a careful, methodical excavation under the oak. It didn't take them long to find what Elias knew they would: 2 more skeletons, buried deeper, the final resting place of Matteo and Elena. Justice, delayed by a century, had finally arrived, delivered by a stubborn old man and his loyal dog. Elias sat on his porch, Buster resting at his feet, and watched as the lights of the official vehicles cut through the rain-swept darkness. A year passed. The story of the Thorn Ranch and the buried family became a brief, sensational headline across the state before fading into local law, as such stories often do. Silas Croft was convicted, his testimony implicating a long history of silence and complicity within his family, a chain of guilt passed down from father to son. The Croft land, tainted by its bloody origins, was seized by the state. In a rare act of poetic justice, it was not sold or developed. It was designated as the Matteo and Elena Memorial Preserve, a protected tract of wild nature, a quiet monument to the family who had paid for it with their lives. The fence between the 2 properties came down. Elias's ranch no longer ended at a line of rusting barbed wire but flowed seamlessly into the protected grasslands. The land felt different now, lighter, cleansed. The ancient oak tree, once a marker of a crime, now seemed to stand taller, its leaves a healthier, more vibrant green. Elias Thorn continued his life, but he was changed. The solitude that had once defined him now felt less like isolation and more like guardianship. He was the keeper of the land's memory, the steward who had righted a deep and ancient wrong. Each evening, he would sit on his porch, Buster, now slower, his muzzle frosted with grey, snoozing peacefully at his side. He would look out over the open expanse, where the setting sun cast a warm, benevolent glow over the preserve. The cicadas still hummed, but their song was no longer tinged with the fever of a hidden secret. It was just the sound of peace. Order had been restored, not by force of law alone, but by the unwavering instinct of a loyal dog and the quiet courage of a man who chose responsibility over safety. He was a guardian, watching over a land that was finally, truly, at rest. If you were moved by the story of Elias and Buster's fight for justice, be sure to watch our next video about a fisherman who discovered a sunken secret that changed his town forever.